Hello, Bay Ridge. Welcome to another edition of After Hours. Today, I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about the relationship between the nature and character of God and sin and redemption. I mentioned this some on Sunday morning, but I want to take a little bit more time to explain why it's so important that we understand those, and what I think about one necessarily affects how I think all the way down the line. This week we were looking at question 23 in our catechism, the question being, why must the Redeemer be perfectly righteous? And the answer we give is the Redeemer must be perfectly righteous so that his obedience and sacrifice in our place would be acceptable to God. But see, many people today struggle with the idea of perfection. Why is it such a big deal? Is sin really that big a deal? I mean, they might even grant and say, well, the things you're praying about with Bombay Teen Challenge and the whole sex slave trade, that's obviously a big deal, but is all sin really that big a deal? But what that uncovers is flaws in the thinking prior to even the nature of sin and redemption, but going back rather to the character of God. And there is a strong link. What one thinks about God will determine what one thinks about sin, will determine what one thinks about redemption. What I mean by that is a low view of God, especially one that minimizes God's infinite sovereignty or his holiness, will tend to lead to a low view of sin and therefore to a low view of redemption. And a low view of sin itself is going to lead to a low view of redemption, because there's not going to be any need for perfection, and there's not going to be any need to bear the wrath of God, because God's not really going to have wrath, because God himself is not that offended by sin, because God himself is this particular type of God. So it's really, really important for us to understand what the scripture actually teaches. And the scripture teaches very clearly that God is infinite, that he is eternal, that he is sovereign, that he is the creator of everything that exists. So the God we are dealing with is not someone who's just a little bit bigger version of us or a little bit more evolved than we are. No, God is an entirely different class of being, an entirely different kind of being. We are finite, we are temporary, we are dependent, and we have been made. But God is infinite, eternal, sovereign. He creates and he owns all things. But not only is that the nature of God, God's character, the scripture is really clear. As I stated on Sunday, he is perfect in holiness, in love, and integrity. In other words, every single character trait of God that you can think about really falls under one of those three things. I've spoken of this before, but when we think of holiness, this is everything like God's justice, God's wrath, God's purity, God's goodness. All of these kind of things flow into what it means for God to be holy. And God's love is everything where we talk about God is kind, he is benevolent, he is merciful, he is forgiving. All of these things are summed up in God's love. And God's integrity is everything about God being true and faithful, that he can be counted upon, that what he says he will do, and that God is unchanging. All of those kind of character traits are summed up in God being a God of integrity. But what this means when we consider the kind of God that we are dealing with, a God who is perfectly holy and perfectly loving and perfectly full of integrity, who will not change, this means sin is a big deal. Because God is infinite, sin against him is infinite in the transgression that has been done. We are offending the infinite God. It is a violation of the will of the infinite holy God, and it demands infinite punishment. Again, as I mentioned a couple of times recently, Anselm, who went through and talked about why atonement was necessary, why the Redeemer had to come, why the God-man. And Anselm kept going back and saying, you haven't considered how great your sin is, but that was rooted in you weren't understanding that you had offended the infinite holy God. And the greater the being that one does something against, the greater the level of offense. If somebody destroyed a little drawing I did, it's not a big deal. But if you destroyed the only copy of a Rembrandt, that's a big deal. okay? Because it has more value because of who paid it. Well, when we transgress, it's not a matter just of me transgressing against another human being. I am transgressing against the infinite, sovereign, eternal God who is perfect in his holiness, love, and integrity, and therefore it demands infinite punishment. The sin and its consequences are infinite, and therefore the punishment is. And what that means, however, is redemption is huge. The need for redemption is so big, and therefore the accomplishment of redemption is going to be so great. It's nothing less than perfect holiness, love, and integrity that is being worked out and being offered to us. And this is so important. And friends, what it does for you and me is this stirs up a desire for me to worship God, because I see how great is the salvation that we have been given in Jesus Christ. Redemption has to satisfy God's wrath against sin. It has to magnify his love for sinful humanity and not change his nature or character. And this is the redemption we've been given in Jesus Christ. So as we gather back together to worship each week, I encourage you, think through that. If we understand who God is, he's not only worthy of our worship, but the redemption he has given us in Jesus Christ is worthy of our worship, because, friends, we have a great God. Our sin is so great, but the salvation from that sin and its effects is greater than we could ever declare with our lips, but we get to spend eternity trying. So I hope you think through this, and it'll stir you as you gather with Connect groups during the week, and then as we gather back together on Sunday to worship our great God. Friends, we have a great salvation because we serve a great God. I look forward to seeing everybody again soon. I hope you have a great week. God bless.